In the last episode, Lin got some easy experiences and merits from the enemies. Not only did he hit level 34, but his corpse explosion also leveled up. Before leaving, he handed a teleportation stone to the Hammer Girl and headed deeper inside the core area to grind more by himself. Meanwhile, deep in the abyss, the Flame Demon Lord had a little meeting with the Succubus Queen. Back to where we left off, the Flame Demon Lord, although still afraid of her, asked the Succubus Queen why she hadn't sent anyone to kill Lin, but she replied, questioning what made him think she didn't. She casually mentioned that both the Crimson Moon Demon and the Abyssal Fire Spirits had been sent. They still couldn't kill Lin, since the both of them are already familiar with the rules of the Eternal Trial Grounds, so she didn't want to waste her time explaining everything again. Instead, she tossed him a gem containing all of Lin's info and told him to stop bothering her. And she might have mentioned that if he dared to come back again, she'd make him seriously regret it. The Flame Demon Lord stared at the black gem for a moment, didn't say a word, absorbed it into his freaky, oversized eyes, and quickly left the place. Meanwhile, Lin had no clue where he was, how far he'd gone, or how many days had passed. What he did know was that he'd finally hit level 35. He checked out the stats on his skellies and undead generals. Everything looked good, so he kept pushing forward. On the Eternal Trial Grounds, there's no day or night, just a timeless blur. Lin figured that if he didn't find the Dragon Palace by level 39, he'd head back and start prepping for his second-class transfer and profession evolution. Honestly, he felt like he was leveling up pretty fast, but compared to his sister, he was light years behind. Her innate talent was insane, letting her level up ridiculously quickly. Lin was sure she'd go down in history as the youngest divine-level professional ever. Just as he was lost in thought, a faint but unmistakable burst of dragon bloodline energy came from the sky. His heart skipped a beat. Could this finally be the Dragon Palace? Without hesitation, he sprinted toward it. It wasn't too far, but after a few minutes of running, something felt off. Normally, a dungeon showing up would trigger a massive spectacle, or perhaps some sort of phenomenon, like an aurora, for example. But this? It was just a faint energy trace. Lin realized he'd gotten so hyped about finding the Dragon Palace that he'd overlooked something obvious. Thinking it over, there were two possibilities. Either the Dragon Palace dungeon wasn't fully formed yet, so the phenomenon hadn't kicked off, or this wasn't the Dragon Palace he was looking for. Before he could think too much, another surge of energy dropped from the sky, forming a vortex right in front of him. Well, this was way too convenient. His gut told him something wasn't right. Still, curiosity got the better of him. Cautiously, he approached the dungeon entrance. The area was eerily quiet. Just him and the swirling vortex. Staying on guard, he scanned the surroundings and, seeing no immediate danger, used a detection spell on the entrance. The second his spell activated, a massive barrier appeared out of nowhere, trapping him inside. Before Lin could react, the barrier completely surrounded him. Yep. It was a trap. The dungeon entrance disappeared, leaving behind a faintly glowing hexagonal crystal on the ground. The weakly glowing crystal radiated an unusual aura. Using his detection spell, Lin quickly identified it as a dragon crystal, the very thing White Divine had told him to go after. Apparently, these crystals carried traces of dragon energy and had the potential to awaken unique talents when used. It was Lin's first time seeing one, but it was obvious that someone had used this as bait to lure him in. Before he could fully process the situation, a burst of maniacal laughter echoed behind him. Lin's brows furrowed as he turned, spotting a massive flaming eye glaring at him. Oh look, it's our old friend. None other than the Flame Demon Lord. But Lin wasn't overly concerned. A quick glance told him it was just a projection, not the real deal or even a clone. Nothing worth panicking about, right? The Flame Demon Lord's voice boomed through the barrier, gleefully declaring that this time, Lin was doomed. For some reason, he seemed really confident about it. Lin, ever the calm and sarcastic type, pointed out this was the upper level, and he's just a projection. What he's gonna do with this barrier? Trap him here forever? On the surface, he looked composed. But inside, Lin was on high alert, trying to piece together what the Demon Lord could be planning. The Flame Demon Lord didn't bother explaining. Instead, he laughed louder. He tells Lin to enjoy his last moments. Soon he will be beaten completely. His mind will be wiped. His body will be reduced to dust. And he will personally make sure Lin becomes a brainless husk before tearing him apart himself. A lot of yapping, but Lin still had no idea what kind of plan the Demon Lord was cooking up. Still, he wasn't about to take any chances. Reinforcing his skeletal armor, he ordered his skeleton warriors to form a tight, protective circle around him. Scanning the surroundings, Lin tried to figure out where the Demon Lord's confidence was coming from. What's the plan here? There was nothing around. No monsters, no traps. So why was the flaming eyeball so sure of himself? Moments later, a thin mist began to rise within the barrier. At first it was barely noticeable, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, but it spread fast, creeping through the space until it cloaked everything. The mist grew thicker with each passing second, obscuring Lin's vision. Not that it mattered. His skeletal warriors kept him aware of his surroundings. However, he didn't seem to notice that every time he took a breath, something began floating into his body. The haze thickened further until his visibility dropped to almost zero. Sitting still wasn't an option. He checked his skeletal armor. No reaction. That meant the mist wasn't poisonous, at least not in the usual sense. He ordered his skeletons to attack the barrier, but their strikes didn't even leave a scratch. Then Lin noticed something strange. With every breath he took, tiny wisps of mist slipped into his body. Still, his armor didn't react, confirming it wasn't directly harmful, or so it seemed. Then he thought he heard something faint. Laughter. Mad, chaotic laughter. And that's when the headache hit. Fragments of memories flashed before his eyes, vivid for a moment before shattering like glass. It was like his life was being played back in a broken loop, but with each frame slipping further out of reach. He clutched his head as the pain intensified, the scenes blurring and fading into nothingness. A sudden flash of light engulfed him. When Lin opened his eyes, he froze. What am I doing? Where am I? His memories scrambled, trying to reorganize themselves. Looking down at his hands, he realized he was standing in the school square. Familiar faces bustled around him, chatting and laughing. None of this made sense. Hadn't he already gone through his class transfer? What am I doing here? A familiar voice snapped him out of his daze. He turned to see Gao Yang, who we hadn't seen in forever, nudged his shoulders, telling Lin it was his turn, and to stop zoning out. Next to him, Charlotte rolled her eyes and said they had been calling his name twice now. What was he daydreaming about? Meanwhile, the principal on the stage called Lin for the third time. Dazed and confused, Lin found himself walking toward the magic array. He had no idea what was going on, but his legs moved as if on autopilot. Standing in the center of the array, a strange, nagging sensation tugged at his gut. I've done this before, haven't I? Or am I forgetting something? The magic array activated. A chilling wind swept through the square. Lightning crackled across the sky as a massive legion of skeletons appeared in the clouds above. The scene burned itself into his mind. Skeletal knights mounted on war horses, robed mages riding skeletal dragons. Then, one of the mages jerked its head up and locked eyes with Lin. Before he could react, the mage unleashed a bolt of green light straight at him. The world shattered. Lin jolted awake, his heart pounding like a war drum. He was back in the eternal trial grounds. The barrier still surrounded him, and the mist was thicker than ever. Was that a dream? His breath hitched as he tried to piece together what had just happened. It felt like he'd been trapped in a place where he had forgotten everything. If not for that green light breaking him out, he might have lost himself completely, becoming a mindless shell, or worse, dying inside the illusion. Then he noticed something strange. His body was covered in soul flames. Oddly enough, they didn't hurt and rather kind of felt comfortable. He studied the flames, trying to figure out what was happening. Looking closer, he realized the soul flame wasn't burning randomly. The flames seemed to be targeting something inside his body. Streams of black mist began seeping out of him, writhing as if desperate to escape the flames. Lin immediately recognized these things. He remembered White Divine describing a rare and deadly type of abyssal demon, the Abyssal Illusion Demon. Tiny, insidious creatures that operated in swarms, with even a single cluster containing tens of millions. Normally they were harmless, until they found a host. That explained why his skeletal armor hadn't reacted. Once inside, though, they unleashed their true terror, creating illusions, corrupting the soul, and erasing memories. Their victims lost their sense of self entirely, becoming mindless puppets to the demon's will. Lin shuddered, his heart pounding at the thought of what could have happened. In hindsight, if that mage in his dream hadn't woken him up, who knew what his fate might have been? The black mist escaping his body didn't get far. Lin unleashed wave after wave of soul flame. Then, Lin demanded the Flame Demon Lord to show himself. The guy finds it hilarious that our boy plans to use flames against him, so he tells Lin no one will ever defeat him in his domain. Lin responded with a cold smirk. Despite knowing it was just a projection, Lin poured every ounce of his power into his soul flame. It was a clean hit. The soul flame landed dead center, completely engulfing the massive eyeball. As the scene shifts to the abyss, in the Demon Lord's grand palace, a sudden burst of soul flame materialized above the Flame Demon Lord's head. He roared in pain, the agony tearing through his very soul as the entire palace quaked violently. "Lord Flame Demon, are you all right?" one demon stammered, trembling as the room shook. Without a word, he turned around and looked at them dead in the eyes. Then in one sweeping motion, every demon in the room was reduced to ash. Clearly he wasn't going to have anyone find out how he was just humiliated by Lin. The palace fell silent. The Demon Lord slumped back onto his throne, breathing heavily. While the attack hadn't caused permanent damage, the brief moment of searing pain had caught him completely off guard. Gritting his teeth, he growled about how he's gonna kill Lin. Yeah, we've heard that one before. At this point, wasn't this like his fourth time saying it? Anyway, the dude also knew Lin wouldn't stay in the eternal trial grounds forever. He bellowed for his subordinates outside the palace, although we had no idea what's his new plan. But we all knew it was likely gonna be another failure. Back to Lin, he watched as the Flame Demon Lord's projection flickered and disappeared, leaving behind a single black gemstone floating gently to the ground. He picked it up and inspected it closely. It was a Demon Lord's gem, a rare artifact formed from the condensed power of an abyssal Demon Lord. He recalled how Alice had once used a similar gem to summon the Succubus Queen's projection. He thought this might come in handy, so he decided to keep it. With that settled, Lin turned his attention to the remaining abyssal illusion demons. Using his soul flame, he methodically hunted them down, destroying every last one. Finally, the barrier surrounding him cracked, then shattered. He let out a deep sigh of relief. The whole ordeal had been way too close for comfort. Luck had played a big part in his survival. If it hadn't been for that mage in the dream, he would have fallen straight into the Flame Demon Lord's trap. But one question lingered in his mind. Who, or what, was that mage? Lin didn't have time to dwell on it. The teleportation stone from Mo Yun started vibrating. He realized Mo Yun must have found the Dragon Palace. Without hesitation, Lin activated the teleportation stone. Seconds later, he found himself in a new location. The moment he arrived, he could sense there were demons, dragons, and of course the dungeon he was looking for. Mo Yun stood not far from him, smiling as Lin arrived. A quick scan with his detection skill confirmed it. This was indeed the Dragon Palace, featuring 3 difficulty levels. Mo Yun beamed proudly, saying how she's faster at finding things. Lin turned to her and said thanks. She blinked, a little surprised at how serious he looked. Waving her hand dismissively, she tells him to not mention it, since this dungeon is way out of her league anyway. At the same time, she knew Lin would be running this dungeon as many times as he could. So if he found any extra dragon crystals, just toss her a few. Lin didn't hesitate and said deal. Before heading in, he's gonna call someone over. Mo Yun was a bit surprised. Lin wasn't exactly the social type, so who could he possibly want to invite? Her first guess was Yi Yi. A second later, Hammer Girl arrived, of course with her signature hammer slung casually over her shoulder. Mo Yun recognized her profession and realized with her around, Lin could easily double all of his loot. While the 3 stood at the dungeon's entrance, their arrival didn't go unnoticed. It didn't take long for the demons and dragons to realize who they were dealing with. However, both of the groups had received orders from their superiors to kill Lin on sight. No exceptions. And just like that, both demons and dragons simultaneously launched their attacks, all aimed directly at Lin.